Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. And on this week's episode, we are going to talk about hope and happiness, unleashing the power of goals and pathways. I think this topic is a mouthful, and it certainly sounds very intriguing. So I'm excited to talk to our guest of the day about this topic. I'm sure we'll learn at least a new thing or two. That's my hope for the day. And today we have in our virtual studio Rodney Luster, PhD, who is a higher education administrator, entrepreneur, and healthcare practitioner who maintains a private practice as a licensed professional counselor with his own company called Inspirethought, as well as Senior Director of Research Strategy, Innovation and Development for the College of Doctoral Studies at the University of Phoenix, where he also leads the Center for Leadership Studies and Organizational Research. Welcome to the show, Rodney. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, I mean, today we are talking about a very big topic. I feel like the words are kind of like, wow, what is this about, right? Hope, happiness, and unleashing the power of goals and pathways. And I know that in your work, it kind of leans towards that, organizational research leadership. I'm sure we're going to cover a lot about professional journey, but this show is about life, right? So we're probably going to touch on life quite a bit too. Now, before we go into the show, I am curious, how did you get to do this work that you're doing?
It's one of those things that you kind of roll into. I think it starts way back, as a kid, and we all go through things in our life, and I can remember just wanting to find out more about how we live in this world and how we do things, and so I think I rolled into this kind of work, especially when we talk about emotions and feelings, and really that there is more than just that. There's more at work, and so it's just kind of snowballed. I think it just comes from also being an artist as well. That's a part of what I do is for many years it was just growing that aspect, and I think artists see things very raw and very real. And so you could kind of sometimes see that in the work of psychologists. They're also artists too, some of them. And so I think I rolled into this from some of that, and from being a dad and a husband, and just, wanting to know more about how to help others too in that way, especially my family and other people I was around. So, just comes through in a lot of ways.
Definitely. I think your point it makes perfect sense to a lot of us, right? It grounds in your values, people around you, and you get inspired by your circles, especially your family. But I'm curious about that aspect of you being an artist. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? We did not get that from your bio at all.
It's something I guess I don't talk about it a whole lot. And again, it's kind of how I grew up. When I was younger, I loved to draw, and by the time I got to college, it was just one of those things where, it just sort of took off. It was something I wanted to do, and they had a hard time finding classes for me because I was already there as far as a lot of the technique and stuff like that. So I took a lot of independent study classes, but I started to have my own art shows, and I was sculpting and painting and doing all kinds of things like that. And Soho Gallery was interested in my work and sold stuff on PBS and did all of that. So I've sort of seen that grow, not only as that kind of artist, but it's kind of flowed into music and writing music and writing fiction. So I just think it's a larger way of communicating. It just comes out that way. So.
Very fascinating. And because we are talking about, goals and pathways today in the context of hope and happiness, how did that relate to your story particularly? Because, you transition from being that, an artist. And I feel like it's not like you are no longer an artist per se. It's more like you transition from being an artist, very creative, into a field where it has to be, a bit more structured. It has to do with more science and you have to do more research. How does that work in the context of goals and pathways for yourself?
I think it's curiosity. I think that drives a lot of what I do as a person, and that's always been a big part of my life. I've been curious about things. Even as a kid, I was curious about, when I would read comic books, the big words in the comic books, I wanted to look those up and see what that meant. And it just kind of, from there, there was an interest in how things work. And I think just the propensity of how we function, how things function, and just, the universe and the world has always amazed me. I look at things a little bit different, I think, in many ways. And so for me, it's just an important part of who I am, and moving into that sort of flow just seemed natural, from art to psychology seemed like a natural move because there's shaping going on there, just like sculpting and things like that. There's understanding and interpreting and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Wow, very interesting. Well, I think we are going to learn a bit more about that when we talk about today's topic, because I'm sure you can relate a lot of the insights that you're going to share today with your own journey. I'll try to relate mine to it as well, so we can, bring some more, just a little more stories to our audience. I find that to be always relatable. Before we get into that, though, let's talk a bit more about you and get some of your recommendations. We have this part called Have You Met Rodney? I'm going to get some of your recommendations about 5 things that we find to be extremely helpful in understanding a person's background. The first thing I would like to ask, and my favorite question of all time, is what is a book you would recommend?
Well, that's a good one. I'm reading a lot of different things right now. I would say the most practical of those would be a book by Norman Dodge, who's a medical doctor who deals with people with chronic pain. And the book is called The Brain's Way of Healing. And it's a really fascinating look at how, when people have come to him with chronic pain, it's hard to figure out, well, what do you do with them when you've tried everything medically possible to help them? And what he has found, just about how our brain kind of works and how that works in connection with the body, and it sort of lights up these other, pain centers that have nothing to do with the central pain, except that they're next to it. They're adjacent to it. So I love that part of it. So that's probably the most pragmatic book I would recommend. I'm reading other fictional stuff like, Bram Stoker's Dracula, just going back and revisiting that and other works like that. But that one is more of the sciencey kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is a scientific show, but we love fiction recommendations too. So thanks for sharing both. Next question is about a movie. What is a movie you would recommend to our audience?
I just saw one the other day that I've been trying to sell to everybody in my family,
Okay.
and it's by M. Night Shyamalan. It's A Knock at the Cabin Door, and I think that's a recent one by him, but it was on. I think it's just been released on Netflix, something like that. But I was watching that the other day, and his movies are very interesting. There's a lot of twists and turns. There's psychological realism there. There's things about the bigger aspects of being a human being, but that one is really interesting for me. That was kind of one I'd recommend, just because it's about doing life too. And his movies don't start out that way. It seems like it's going to be something else.
Yeah.
But by the end, you start thinking, wow, I never saw that coming. So I
Yeah.
would recommend that one.
Okay. Very, very interesting and sold. I will definitely make sure to put that on my list. Thank you for that. Okay. Next question. What is a podcast you would share with our audience?
I've sort of been a fan of Dr. Drew Pensky and his podcast. I like the way he positions things and the way he talks about them, both scientifically and some of the guests he has on. He's very innovative with certain things too. And as a doctor and psychiatrist, some of the stuff that he does is really interesting. So that one, and then probably TED Talk has a TED Health podcast that is also sort of the same way. There's a lot of interesting topics in there. Again, it's sort of me interested and curious and wanting to find out how we pick things apart and what's behind them. So, but I would recommend those. I like those too.
Yeah, very cool. I have not heard about the first one, Dr. Drew. That's new to
Dr.
me.
Drew, yeah.
Yeah, very new. And TED, I did not know they have a podcast for just health specifically as well. So,
It's TED. They have a
yeah,
lot of things. So
they
TED
do.
Health.
Yeah, well, that's really cool. All right, very on brand for this podcast as well. I'm sure our audience would enjoy that. Now, who is your role model? I know we said famous, but it doesn't have to be a famous person if this is someone in your circle.
You know, so I think when I was in college, I think one of my role models, because I was starting to study psychology, was Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist. And,
Yeah.
that one was very profound to me. And at the time, he was still alive. Uh, his work was just really fascinating and interesting. I thought it was great because here you had one man who was involved with another man who was attempting to destroy, people as we know it, and yet he indirectly comes in encounter with him, and then he's then the counter to that, and really ends up helping millions of people. So he's awesome. I think
Yeah.
he really did some things that were very profound to help us understand more about why love is important, why caring is important. But him and Eric Fromm, who's another social psychologist, I like him. Contemporary Peter Levine, Wake the Tiger. I've worked with Peter Levine. Martin Seligman. I think since we're talking about happiness, he's another one that's all about happiness. He's even got his own formula for happiness. So I think those are sort of the guys that I'm looking up to right now. I think they're all interesting. So.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you don't have just one, but you kind of have multiple, role models and people that you can learn from. And I think that's the beauty about, having people that you can admire and look up to, because you learn something from each person, not just one.
Truly, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a mosaic, I think. in many
Definitely.
ways.
That's a really nice word to describe it. Totally. Last question in this part. What is a course you completed that left a really strong impact on you to this day?
Well, I think one of them was human sexuality. That was a graduate class. I think for me, it was, it's something that I don't think my parents ever really talked to me about sex and, all of that. But that was a chance when I was an adult to really kind of dig in and really understand more about, just who we are, our sexual identity and what that means. That was an important class. There was another one that I had, and it was about women in leadership. And what was funny about that is I needed that class as part of my graduation requirement. When I wound up in the class, I was the only male in the class.
Okay.
So I think I became the barometer by which all men really could be measured in that class. And I didn't want to be.
Okay.
But I thought it was a great class. It opened my eyes to just what women struggle with, what has been the struggle, Everything from the glass ceiling to real stories by some of these women that were in the class that were leaders. So that was another impactful one. And then I'm going through one right now with Mount Sinai Hospital on using hypnosis with cancer patients. I'm not completely done with that course, but that's more for just adding to sort of my bench strength when working with clients. But that one's really a cool class. I think that one will probably have a big impact once I'm done with it.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Definitely. I really love both of those courses that you shared. The first one, super impactful, especially, because it's you're from another perspective. And, from your perspective, especially if you enjoy that, then it must be absolutely, impactful for everyone. And the second one, well, you're still going through it. So we hope to hear some good news about it. I'm sure you're probably going to write about it on Psychology Today. Um,
Probably so. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. So yeah, we'll wait, and we'll look forward to seeing an article about what you've learned. Now, let's talk about today's topic. It's been a while coming, and I'm excited to talk to you about hope and happiness. Unleashing the power of golden pathways. Once again, I had to read this title a few times, and I was kind of imagining in my mind what was going to happen in this conversation. I still don't know where it's going to go, so I'm excited to find out. But the first question we always ask, especially since the show is about happiness, is what is your personal definition of happiness?
I've arrived at this through a lot of things that I've studied about this particular topic. I think about stuff like Zhang Zhao, the Chinese philosopher, and how he said perfect happiness is sort of the absence of striving for happiness. And Aristotle, had his own beliefs. Socrates, thought that we had to really kind of turn our attention away from the physical and kind of focus on the soul. Really that notion of happiness, it's been thought out quite a bit by me and by many other people, but I think we think about it internally. How does it relate to ourselves? So your question, my own personal definition, I'd probably say that happiness is a momentary joyful state where we sort of have this contentedness that is the provisional ground floor, is what I would say. And it's also the gateway for the enlargement of what can be even more so, sort of the outpouring of more things that emerge from our own sort of derived perceptions that are internalized. So that kind of sounds like a lot of words there, but really, I think the word there is potentiality. It's the potentiality in what we can be and feel and do, if we allow that to happen. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of where I'm going with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a new one on this show, a new kind of definition for sure, and especially the word that you used, potentiality. I think this is the first time we've used that word on this show ever, so that's new. And I think I like it because a lot of the times we have this discussion on this show quite a bit where we talk about happiness is not the end goal, and I think your definition is an extension of that because a lot of the times we're kind of like, oh, I just want to be happy. But it's not really the end. It's actually, like you said, a gateway to something else. Because when I think this is relatable to everyone, actually, when we have that feeling or that state of being happy or, having happiness in our lives, we start to think about, oh, what else can I do with my life? This is good and this is great, and what more can I bring to whether it be a relationship, a friendship, your family, or even bigger than that, this world. So there's so much to happiness that I think we don't cover, especially because it's kind of like it's your individual approach and your personal definition. And sometimes, well, we are humans, we can be a little bit selfish and we think about ourselves only. But I think when we kind of enlarge that a little bit more, it's a beautiful thing to think about. And I think collectively, if we all, have moments of happiness, we bring a lot more to one another and to this world. So yeah.
Absolutely. And your word personalized is very important to that because, it is very a personalized thing.
Yeah.
There are various components to that too.
Definitely. Look, I think it's, again, very personal to each person. It's kind of, I think it's also, it depends on the state of life that you're into. For some people, it's really simple. For some people, it's much more complicated than that. But I think when you kind of go through the different works that you've done, probably lots of research, probably talking to a lot of people, you might notice that sometimes people have this view or certain views of happiness that might be detrimental to themselves. So then my next question would be, what are some of the biggest misconceptions do you think people have when it comes to happiness?
Yeah, we see that all around us too. I think if you watch a Hallmark movie, hey, I like Hallmark movies, so I'm the first one to say they're nice, but that idea that I quit my job and I open a cookie shop and fall in love and all of that stuff. Those are nice things, but they lack some of the depth. The perfect Christmas, all of those things, that the ratcheted up expectations. I think that's where people assume that maybe happiness is that sort of Pollyanna kind of state of I'm just happy all the time, and life is great and everything, and again, that's sort of the mythical aspect of I think where people hold themselves up against something that is unrealistic. I
Mhm.
also think that people think that happiness is sort of this durative, elongated state of being, that once you're there, and that's where you stay. and that's so far removed from the truth. Um,
Yeah.
it reminds me there's I had a client the other day, and he shared a poem with me by a poet. Khalil Gibran is the name of the poet, and the poem was called Joy and Sorrow. And one line struck me. It was the very first line of the poem, and it says, "Your joy is sorrow unmasked." And that really struck me because I think what he was talking about in that particular poem is really what we call emodiversity, emotional diversity, the spectrum of emotions that we could and should experience. And that term actually comes from some work that's really not that long ago, and shortly after 2010, somewhere around 2014. But some researchers were looking at this sort of ecosystem of emotions, and they came up with this word, emodiversity. And really, that particular line, and this is kind of where I draw from this, where people may get it wrong, is that if you start to remove the lows and just keep the highs, as though you assume that life should just be highs, no lows, you're missing something great in the whole mixture of happiness. Because it's like sort of that old saying about tasting the bitter to appreciate the sweet.
Yeah.
It is different. You begin to imagine a world where everyone's just happy all the time. You'd probably have somebody eventually who's like, I'm not happy because everybody's happy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a weird sort of way. I think
Yeah.
that's where we have to consider that one of the greatest formulas for this is when we take into account that whole spectrum of mixed emotions,
Mhm.
and what that means. So I think when we talk about people getting it wrong, um, that idea where, um, you know, what we think is happiness. And some people find it in, if I go out and buy a new car, that's going to make me happy. If I win the lotto, that's going to make me happy. And we know that's not true. In fact, there's research that goes way back that says that none of that stuff really does change anything because it's not meaningful. In fact, people that kind of chase those kind of things, money and stuff like that, we sort of look at that as habituated, which really the person starts to get accustomed to it, and it loses it doesn't hold the same value. It loses its meaning. There's no deeper meaning there for those kind of things. And so that's where people get it wrong too, is that they can find happiness through those kind of things that really are sort of superficial.
Yeah.
They're not deeper in the respect that we're human beings. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot more to us than just trying to placate our needs. So
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think from my perspective, at least just for me personally, the lows really help to kind of, for me, open my eyes to new things. What I mean by that is when life's good, it's enjoyable, and happiness is there, and that's a wonderful thing to enjoy. But when I go through challenging patches, I feel like I learn so much more about the world, and I kind of, in a way, find hope and purpose. And because today we're talking about hope, I think I'm gonna relate to that heart in a little bit, and lots of people can do that too. Um, and here's another thing. I agree with your definition and the misconceptions you were saying, because I feel like all great stories sort of come with this happened. And so I decided to do this.
exactly.
It
Yes.
never is like, oh, I was so happy that I went and did that for the
Right.
world, you know?
Right.
So that's really
Absolutely.
interesting when you really think about it. All of these great inventions, or, the great changes that happen, it is most of the time because of some lows happen in somebody's lives.
Yes.
And then they decided to do something to change it.
You know, it's funny because I think about this related to even my own life. You know, I think when I think about some of the happiest times in my life, they were happening amidst some of the hardest things that were occurring. You know, I can remember, you know, when my wife and I were just starting out, and we didn't have really a lot. And I remember how much it took for us just to scrape up, you know, some money to go see a movie together. But those movies were the best times ever, you know, and being able to have that. And it's funny because I can go to a movie now, and if you ask me how does that relate to back then, I would tell you there was just something magical back then. And it was because we were really sort of in it with the highs and lows.
Yeah.
You know, and we didn't have that sort of idea of you know what, this is just sort of this expectant thing, you know, that will make me happy, because that doesn't last. But
Yeah.
we never knew if we were going to get to a movie or not. so so you know, we were happy when we did, you know.
Yeah.
And so I can
Beautiful.
think of all those moments where there was something going on that you would say, how could you have been happy then? And
Mm.
I will, you know, tell you, I was probably the happiest I've ever been then
Yeah.
when we were going through things. So
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good perspective to share with others, because that helps us to kind of embrace whatever comes our ways, right? It's not always going to be the highs, it's not going to be happiness all the time. And we all know that. We just kind of try to avoid it sometimes. But as I said, the lows are important. For me personally, very important. And I'm sure our audience can relate to this in one way or another, depending on where they are at in their lives. And regardless of our background, we've probably gone through at least some lows in our lives. So yeah, that's actually, I think another thing about lows is, I mentioned earlier, is hope. When you kind of go through these phases of like feeling really low, or you go through really tough things, what kept you going would probably be a combination, amalgamation of a lot of different aspects, but one of which is hope that we have within ourselves. And I know we're talking about hope today in the context of happiness. So I would very much love for you to share a bit more with us. Let's set the scene for this conversation. Where are we going with it? Because hope can be something we talk about all the time. I'm sure someone today, or later today will say to you, "Oh, I hope you have a great day," or "I hope you had a great day," or something along that line. So how should we define hope in this context, especially psychological well-being, happiness, and so on?
Yeah, I think it can be a pop culture thing too when we hear people just say it, I hope this or I hope that, or this it's a word that's utilized a lot, and maybe it needs more color added to it. And so let's do that a little bit. And inside of this, I think, that there was a piece that I wrote in Psychology Today, and part of it was, started, how do I start this piece out about hope? And first thing that came to mind was a song and it's an old song by the Police, the rock group, the Police, and it's called The King of Pain. And my son actually loves that song. He's very artsy. But that song, that first line, there's a little black spot on the sun today. Mm. And that is the way I started writing that particular article, because I think I had to start with understanding what does it mean on the inverse of that when you talk about hopelessness, when somebody doesn't have hope, so that we can better understand what actually hope is, and so that's kind of how I started writing it, and really when you start looking at what hopelessness is, and the people that maybe I've encountered in my practice are in just in the world in general, we might think of it as sort of the serious condition that increases maybe and enhances the aspects of disappointment and depression. That's one way to think of that sort of that absence of that element. It's an absence of excitement of life. And then when you take it to the next level, well, then what does it mean to sort of have this serious level of hopelessness, this acute hopelessness, and really, that's more of the persistent sort of despondent feeling that somebody may have, and that could be having that comes along with negative, maybe expectations that there will always be a black spot on the sun today when I get up, that sun will never be clear. And so it's governed by this complete loss of motivation. So you start thinking about that, and a person who is hopeless, I think it's a lot like that song, that everything is painful. And so getting up starts with that perspective of, it's not going to be a sunny day because of that spot. And so then let's now look at, okay, so well then what is hope? What's the counter to that? And you can read a lot of things about, hope in the literature, and you'll see that there's a lot of maybe even disagreement about what it is. Some people think it's like a cloud that you can't hold in your hand. It's this amorphous sort of thing that people talk about, and that some people think it's spiritual. There's all kinds of context for it. But what we know is that it sort of does have, when you look at what hope is, it's sort of this futuristic construction of life that we may have about what tomorrow may look like, and will it be a good day tomorrow? And so we can look at it, through the lens of a lot of things. But I think, hope is really more complex than that. It boils down to more than just some of those clinical sort of definitions of it. For me, in the context of what that means for a person who is looking at a better quality of life, I think hope it's not this amorphous thing, that it's really more of a positive, healthy state of well-being. And where I think it comes from, and what I've seen and what I felt, is that it comes from this deep sense of purposefulness that you engage each day with. And it means digging into your own self-agency to help do that, to help drive towards tangible outcomes, so that it's not this amorphous thing. So if you give, if a person has one small success in the day, so if it's somebody who is depressed and they're like, I can't get up, I just can't. And if I can help them at least move from the bed to the shower, and just feel that good feeling, that's a success. That may give them hope that, hey, if I can do that little thing, then maybe I can build on that. And that's a big part of it. So I do think it comes from, this core driven thing of purposefulness. Having a purpose is a big deal. And if you shake that up in a person's life and you take that away from them, then you get these other things. You get people who are sad and depressed, and that sometimes happens with people who even retire and they're just like, okay, well, what do I do now? Yeah, there's nothing to get up for anymore, and they haven't found a way to successfully age. There's a hopelessness there sometimes. So it can happen at any age. I think, I see it with young clients. I see it with old clients. I see it, it doesn't matter. We're all human beings. I think we can get struck by that feeling. There was a lot of that going on during the pandemic as well. I saw a lot of that happening. But I also saw the counter to that too, which was interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is something we observe pretty much every day, when we interact with others. And social media is a big part of it. You see this all the time. You see stories and you can sort of resonate with it. Sometimes you find it in yourself. Do I have hope today? Or not really? I think it's a pretty grim thing to kind of say out loud, but I'm sure or maybe our audience have not gone through that, but for me, I had that before where I had no hope. And I think I really really resonated with what you were saying earlier, just moving from the bed to the shower. There was a really long time before I don't remember exactly which year it was, but that was the first time I encountered depression, and I couldn't really understand why I couldn't get out of bed and why everything was gray. It was really strange because it was summer in Melbourne. It was gorgeous, always sunny, but for some reason I just couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't even eat, and that was really clear to me. Oh, I didn't have hope. Obviously, it didn't come to me like that. It came like I think a few weeks later. But when I realized that, it was like this realization. I was like, oh, whoa, this never happened before. Never thought this could be a thing. Like having hope in my life. I took it for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where it becomes very easy. It's the word itself. I think when we think about that word, it conjures up sort of this mystical realm
Yeah.
for people, and really, they may think of it as something that is elusive. That even if they can understand it, it's like, well, that's not a part of my life right now. I
Yeah.
don't even know how that works. How do I get there? And so, just like you're saying, I remember having when I first started out and I was doing my internship, and I was working at an addictions clinic. You would see some of that sometimes. It was always about instilling hope, though, in the clients that we had. And I was sort of the guy who, I wasn't the addictions counselor, but I was sort of the surplus counselor there to help with some of the other emotional content. And I remember asking somebody around that idea of hope and kind of how they really approached, their day and how they got out of their depression. And I remember it was brilliant. They told me it was actually action before motivation. And I thought that was amazing when they said that, because really it's, you're talking about a perception, and willpower and all this stuff. And here's the funny thing about that is that sometimes when we think too much, we can think ourselves out of things. And perception is a big part of hope too. I think it governs a lot of things, and I think it trumps willpower. And so, and I know later on in our conversation, maybe I'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more, but that has a lot to do with the ingredients of hope, I think, is perception, and helping shape some of that too.
Yeah, I think there's so much to it. And my personal observation is we shouldn't take it for granted because there's really that really big correlation between hope and happiness. to me, at least personally. So for our audience who might not really have thought about this before, what is that, what is that relationship between hope and happiness?
There's a, hope and happiness. I think there's a consciousness to that. And by that, I mean, there's a level of awareness that it's there. There's connective tissue there as well too. We know that when a person has hope, it can change the dynamics of many things. In fact, there's some great lectures online about, and one of them was from a Harvard MD, who was talking about how he saw people with hope who were given really bad sort of medical prognosis, and really the ones who did better and even went into remission from some of the things that they were suffering from. The main flavor of that, the main ingredient was hope and happiness, and they found a way to bring those into the storm. And that sort of tempest of illness or whatever it is they were experiencing. I think that's where you see them. They can be great partners, because they do have something to do with each other. You'll find that in a lot of happy people, and a lot of the research shows this. There was a great study where they took probably 37,000 respondents, and really that's what emerged, is that a lot of the happiness factors had these other elements, and hope was one of them. Hope was a big part of that. I think you'll find that in people who really are navigating life, and that connective tissue is there. Hope is one of those ingredients for happiness. And it again, it can affect so many things. We see how, what we think becomes what is in our body. And so that this whole connection between mind and body and the manifestation of things that happen. When I'm anxious, if I think about it, maybe I take up my autonomic nervous system and my body starts to respond, and it becomes a physical thing. The same thing happens when we have hope and happiness in our lives. Happiness sort of being the resilience builder, and sort of the armor that helps us in some ways, and hope being the great motivator, to keep going and keep doing, even despite things that maybe knock us down.
Yeah.
And what we learn from those things, like you said. So I see that connective tissue there. I think they're married, they're partners.
Yeah. So true. I think it's not just a one-sided relationship. It is pretty much like a two-way street. They go hand in hand, and one cannot exist without the other in a way. Kind of fuel each other, and that's what I've seen, especially from firsthand experience. But today we are talking about this terminology, pathways, goals, and pathways, and I think one of the concepts that probably emerged from your work that we found is pathway thinking, and we really want to make sure that relationship between hope and happiness is sort of well maintained in our lives. So I'm guessing pathway thinking has something to do with it. So what is this concept of pathway thinking, and how does it help us to foster hope?
Well, that emerged from a conversation I had with one of my colleagues. His name is Dr. Chan Hellman. He's been a TEDx speaker, and he also runs the Hope Research Center. And he's doing some great studies about hope, actually. And one of them, and you might be a little upset that I let the cat out of the bag right now, but they are doing some brain research, and they got approval to do this really in a big way. And so they're going to start looking for hope in the brain, which is kind of an interesting thing. But where is this idea of hope, this feeling, where does it emerge from? Where's it located? Can we place it somewhere? But in that conversation, he's a brilliant guy. And when we were talking about pathway thinking, this dialogue sort of arose from that. And really it's pathway thinking is just like it sounds. It's, just like the neurons in our brains create pathways, like little etches in a record. Those things are recorded. The brain is very malleable that we can create new pathways. And so where there was maybe a pathway of hopelessness or a pathway of unhappiness, we can start to create a new pathway based on how we think about things. So we might define it as sort of a scaffolded cognitive and evidence process where you start with building blocks in one's life. And you're just setting up these successive blocks. And it starts with short-term goals. And that really is a big part of it. It may be instead of living too far out in the future, because for some people that's not conceivable, especially when they don't have hope or happiness in their life. To think about the future is kind of hard. It's obfuscated and cloudy. And so, coming back to this idea of pathway thinking, we're thinking about the smaller building blocks that get you to the better places, that help modify your own perceptions. And that's the trick here. You need these small steps that slowly work on perception, because perception isn't changed globally, in one instance. It's done over time. And so it may be that, let's just say that you came out of the doctor's office and they said, okay, I hate to tell you this, but, your sugar levels are high. You may have diabetes. This is where you're at. And you're thinking in your head, oh my gosh, this sounds hopeless, and then you ask the doctor, can I change this? And the doctor says, yeah, you can change it. You're going to have to lose some weight, and you're going to have to change your diet and that kind of stuff. So maybe and you go home and you look at that situation and you start to think, okay, what's one small way I can start to change this so that I optimize my health? Maybe I'm going to go join a gym. That's the first step. Maybe if I just do that and go a couple of days a week, and then once I do that, and let's just say I go to the gym, I might feel a little bit better. And maybe I do kind of want to, change my diet. Maybe it's just cutting out something small from that. So the pathway begins. And then that again is the pathway thinking starts to get activated a little bit more with the effect of confidence and one's own sense of self-agency, locus of control, those kind of things that help us see that, this isn't something that is just irreconcilable or eclipsed by bad news. Things can change, and we know that. And I think it's exercising those options in our perception to say that, what, yeah, I can look at it that way. But if I take one small step in the other direction, what are the possibilities? What could happen? And sometimes people just need that one little victory. And so pathway thinking is, you can think of it just like when we were kids and we played with blocks. You stack that first block, and then you go and you stack 2 and then 3 and successively try to stack more. And that's really the sort of the metaphor for that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really useful way to look at how we can realistically, foster our level of hope, because it can be this really vague concept. It's you can't really touch it. You don't really know what it is. You vaguely know what it feels like, but to get
Yeah.
there, it's harder. And I think I like it in the sense that, for all of us, we can probably relate to this like a little game we play with ourselves, right? It's like, okay, how do I design this, pathway today? How do I get to the next level? Like if each day is a little level and I can just start small, then what can I do? And I think that's probably more fun to some people, and gives them excitement and certainly hope, to a certain extent. I find this to be very helpful. I'm just thinking about how this can be applied in, in tough situations, or, when you're going through really rough patches, which we all do. But, also I think there's this other way of looking at it too, where, we are, and this can happen, probably in the therapy room, or, when we approach it in a therapeutic manner. So the pathway thinking is one way to look at it. The other way to also see this is probably when you work with people with mental health issues. And I'm sure you can share a bit more insights with us about this. What would be some of the principles for the hope theory? I find it interesting. There's this concept, the hope theory. Maybe we touched on it a little bit. Maybe we haven't covered all of it. But how does it work when people are actually struggling with deep and distressing mental health issues? Because it's different when you're talking about difficulties in life versus when someone is really struggling mentally and they can't really see a way out. It's kind of hard because there are all these brain chemicals, right? And that's at least a few things I've learned from this podcast. It's not as easy as it sounds. So for those people, and for people going through things like that, how can we approach it, especially for yourself as a licensed professional counselor? I'm sure you have a few things you can share with our audience.
Yeah, I think, when I encounter, clients who come to me and maybe they're challenged, just like any of us would be, with something major that has happened in their life, or maybe it's an illness or a continuous issue. And I've had that before, and usually it starts out with, I've been depressed. I've been this way for a long time. It's hard, to see any kind of hope in any of this. I struggle with this. Can you help me? And that's the big sort of silver bullet kind of question. Can you make it go away? And for me, when I encounter clients, it's baby steps. I think when we look at, and I think it's with any of us, again, that's a big pill to swallow when we talk about, is there a way out of this thing that I'm feeling? And so a big part of that is for me to understand, sort of where this began, this thinking, how did it start? And really it can start to build on each other. When we have negative thoughts, those thoughts stimulate something called FOSB protein in the brain. That FOSB starts to stack up because we go there. We keep going there and tapping that, whether it's good or bad. And we can stack that enough that it's hard to degrade that protein in our brain. So we have to, the only way to undo that is to unstack it. And so that comes through really modifying our perceptions and gaining a stronger sense of intrinsic control. And how we do that is we start with some of the basics. How did we arrive here? And we start looking at the thinking associated with that, and the maladaptive thinking. The idea that somebody comes in and they'll say, "Oh, I'm never happy," and I'll challenge them on that. So you're saying there's not one moment where you haven't had a smile, or we have to break that down, and they'll be like, "Well, yeah, but most of the time I'm unhappy." So we'll start to dig away at some of that, but a big part of that is helping them to reclaim a sense of ownership in their own ability to approach a day, to approach an hour. In fact, the next hour of their time, or the day or the week or the month. And if we can just get through the day and approach that day and the next hours that happen, we can really start to do some good work. And so
Yeah.
that's where psychotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy have a big part in that. They play a big part because we have to dialogue about things, and we can't just do it by ourselves. I once had a doctor friend of mine who said that she once tried to operate on herself by stitching herself up, and she said it was a mess. And I never forgot that, because I'm thinking that's a lot like us. When we try to do life by ourselves, it gets messy. It's like us operating on ourselves, which is why it's good to have somebody to dialogue with, to help you just kind of have that ability to ventilate, to talk. And then you have somebody who can help you with some of that. It's even better. But again, a big part of it is really taking stock at how we live our days, and even hour by hour. What does that mean for us?
Yeah.
That's where we start with this basic idea of where did this first begin, and then we have to sort of really look at the reality of, are we really looking at all these things in the context of the way we need to, or are they colored by how we feel right now? And if we
Yeah.
feel a certain way, then the rest of the world is colored a certain way, probably. So
Yeah, totally. That is so true, because I think we tend to be our own sort of sometimes cheerleader, other times our own worst enemy in that sense. Where, when it's really good, we amplify it. And when it's not so great and we don't feel as good, we just magnify all the bad things, and just take away all of our thinking from what is actually going on. And I think it happens to the best of us, right? Life happens. And sometimes you just kind of, you're like, oh, okay, this is so bad. Everything is bad. Actually, it's not.
absolutely. It
you know?
happens to me too. I
Yeah.
don't have the binoculars to look at myself. and to, even though I do this, I'm better with other people, but
Yeah.
that's how we are as human beings. And
Yeah.
when we're in that place, and I try to educate clients about sort of what's happening, make them the educated. So we take some of the steam out of this. So I'll tell them, that feeling you've got right now, that's happening right here in your brain. And I'll point to that part, and I'll tell them this is the limbic system. And I'll tell them, what happens in that area when we're feeling this way is that's a lot of cortical real estate there, because it lights up like a big light, and all of this executive functioning starts to dim. And when we're back here in sort of this midbrain area, that's really kind of consumes us, and we have to get out of that area. So being able to have constructive things, even goals, like we talked about with hope, that brings you front brain, but that moves you back into that area. And if you just get a little distraction, and what we call cognitive diffusion, sort of stepping back from the painting, you might say, then it starts to take a different look and feel for the person who's experiencing it. They have a chance to sort of catch their breath.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really good insights. And to a lot of us, it's like a constant reminder that we need every day, because it's easy to get sucked into that thinking. And there's that pathway building, pathway thinking you were talking about earlier. In a way, we can build the really good pathway, and but if we don't catch ourselves, we can build really bad pathways as well, because it's just one bad block, and then the next one is also bad, and you just don't really get out of there. um, I think it's a vague concept. Again, hope, it's kind of vague to talk about, but when we break it down into why things happen to us and why we feel a certain way, we can really try to understand. And you're so right in saying that we need to understand why it happened in the first place, right? Because sometimes it's just easy to go to conclusion everything is bad. um, and I know we have so many more things we want to ask you, but I'm so conscious of time. So I just want to make sure I ask you this, because we know that you are going to present or I'm hoping you haven't done that. It's upcoming, isn't it? The APA 2023 conference.
Actually, I've already presented. So
You've already
that was,
presented.
yeah, that
Okay.
was in Washington. That was one of them. But I am going to present this again, Sam, at
Uh-huh.
another conference. So
Oh, okay. Yeah. So
yeah.
you've already presented it. Probably we said upcoming when we were preparing the questions, but you've already presented at the conference, and that was on engaging personality assessment for self-understanding and fostering strong relational dynamics. That sounds like a mouthful. It sounds intriguing. I wonder if it has anything to do with hope, and if so, what is it?
I think it's a part of it. It's the way to sort of unleash the potentials of hope and happiness. Um, it and it has a lot to do with the way that we perceive things, our perception, and really sort of leading into active imaginal practices, thinking, active imaginal thinking, and by that, it's really allowing yourself to imagine maybe a different outcome or a different scenario or a different feeling state. And I've done this so often with clients, and a lot of this came from a conversation I had with Dr. Alvaro Pascal Leon, and he is a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. He and his researchers did some fantastic research that they ended up looking at different people to see if they engaged active imagination, what would happen, in the brain. And so they studied that. In fact, they had these scans of the brain, and what they did was they had people, one group to play notes on the piano, and they hooked up their fingers and everything in their brain and everything. So then the second group was to simply imagine playing the piano notes, the same ones.
Oh
And then the
yeah.
third group didn't do any of that. And the funny thing is, when you look at it, and it's really super cool to see this, but you look at the scanned images, and the ones who imagined are very close to the same, and almost the same as the ones who are actively doing it. And so that idea is very powerful because, again, we're talking about perception, self-concept, our possible selves. How do we engage some of that? I think active imaginal thinking is a big part of that. And I do that practice. I'll run people through these, what I call these short sprint cognitive imaginal walkthroughs, and it only takes about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'll start to describe a scenario where we can exercise maybe a different perspective and what that looks like. If
Yeah.
somebody's nervous all the time and they just are like, I'm never happy when I'm at work, and I don't like it because sometimes they tell me to present things or things like that, then we'll walk through that. But I will start to suggest some of the things that they won't allow themselves to suggest to themselves. So I'm actually speaking to their subconscious in many ways.
Mm.
And that's sort of listening in the background. But I think sometimes we have to give people permission um, to experience things that they don't allow themselves to experience. And we can do this with ourselves daily. I've worked with even athletes for this. It's that idea of that self-talk. That's another way to think of this, is that idea of activating that self-talk, that self-dialogue. What's your inner dialogue like? If you mess up on something, do you say, oh, I'm just, that's me, I'm a failure, or do you say something different, like that was just that instance, I know I can do a better job, that kind of thing. But that's part of it. It's really helping shape our self-perception, our own internal dialogue. And so this practice is a really cool practice. I will do this with clients sometimes who need it, who are trying to change circumstances. I had one
Mm.
client who is having trouble sleeping, and and that was sad for him because he wanted to sleep, but sleeping meant going to the bed, and the bed had negative connotations for him that went way back to childhood and how he experienced going to bed, and so for he and I, we walked through a different scenario. So that bed became an acronym for better enhanced deepener. And
Oh,
so he starts to modify that perception of what bed means so that sleep and bed are no longer unconnected, but they become connected. And he felt happy. He loves the short walkthrough, and I recorded that for him, and he uses it, hopefully daily now, but he loves it. Then again, it's that opportunity to open up our perception, and sometimes we have to do that in our imagination, because our imagination is very strong, and again, that part of us, if we just sort of tap into that, and we can see ourselves. You hear this all the time: see yourself as the person you want to be, or have that
yeah.
perfect picture of what you aspire to, things like that. That's kind of what they're alluding to.
Hmm.
We're really trying to shape that sort of idea of who we are. And I think in many ways, when we're talking about hope and happiness, in that context, we're talking about really how we see ourselves and how we act on our own disposition of who we are and our world around us. Because it really is our own personal journey. So we need to figure out, how to live that journey the best way we can. And if we've had sort of these negative social ingressions or things that try to tell us counter to that, then we have to remember that those things are external, and we have to go and look at where's our intrinsic part here that we can control, because we do have options. And if we have options, that's one of our greatest strengths.
Yeah.
So again, it opens up a number of things. Hopefully
Yeah.
that kind of addresses the question a
Oh,
little bit. I
yeah,
know I kind of went,
totally.
yeah,
Yeah. No, very fascinating. I think it's
yeah,
kind of like some of our audience might probably wonder, is that similar to the law of attraction, or like that kind of like you mentioned it yourself, imagine, let's say your future self, or your ideal self, or something like that. And interestingly enough, it sounds to me like this actually, scientifically speaking, it makes sense, because you're kind of actually building that pathway in your brain, and um, subconsciously you're probably working towards it without knowing, which is interesting. I
yes,
think yeah,
absolutely.
it's very cool.
There's so much that we're starting to understand about the brain. We're way beyond the medieval
Yeah.
prehistoric days of the sword and the dinosaurs. So
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah.
this is where it's really neat to see the power of what we're seeing and what can be
Yeah.
done. So
Yeah. I find it fascinating because I had this debate with my friend over the weekend about, you know, doing different things in lives and why we do certain things, and, religion and spirituality, and, like what's the difference, and everything. And I was kind of going towards that direction, similar to what you were talking about, where, we start to think about something more, we nurture that pathway more. And my friend was kind of saying, well, that's spirituality and it's not that different from religion. And I'm like, I think it is different. It is, this is like, I mean, I'm no neuroscientist, but I think it has to do with the brain, because we cannot just manifest something to come into life without actually working on it. And nothing comes out of thin air. So there's got to be a reason. And I think today you kind of touched on that a little bit, where actually, like the brain pathways and things that actually happen here. That example, I think I read it somewhere, the playing piano one. I think I saw that somewhere. And then I think there was another example of exercising, which was similar. Like, someone who's actually exercising versus someone who's thinking about exercising. Kind of like the same region of the brain lit up or something along that line. So fascinating.
I
Yeah.
mean, it really is. I think that's the wonderful thing of how we're built.
Mm.
we're starting to see it all unfold in many different ways. It's fascinating. I find that even down to just the way things again work. I think it started when I first saw a butterfly, caterpillar and butterfly thing as a kid, and I'm like, oh my God, And I think that's hope personified in many ways. In some ways, that butterfly that's waiting to sort of, the caterpillar never looks up, but when they move through that change, and it's not the best and most inviting change for that species, because they break down in order to become something bigger and something more beautiful. And so,
yeah. Okay. I think you've mentioned something really practical already, but in the next part, we have a practice section. So let's get extra practical here. I think you mentioned that, when you were working with your client, there's a certain technique or a certain thing you suggest to them to do, which is going to help to cultivate hope. But let's talk about goals and pathways. I think the pathway thinking, you mentioned that briefly already, but what would be a practice that you probably do personally, or if you don't have anything you do personally but you recommend quite a bit to your clients or people that you work with to unleash this power of goals and pathways? What would that be?
I think a big part of it is finding sort of the purpose in that. For me, it's a big part of looking at even what I value, and what is it that I value. So for me, I did this not too long ago because I was feeling like I was taking on too many tasks, and you could start to feel that, and it was almost self-imposed in many ways. And so I started looking at what I value, what is really important to me in my life, and a big part of that came out of that was freedom. And I thought that was interesting. I value freedom. So how do I make that a part of my daily routine so that I don't feel overworked or stressed in that way, that kind of thing? And so what I do is I take an hour and I calendar it. There's an hour at the beginning or the end or the middle of the day, and I do whatever I want in that hour. That's living between the lines is what I call it. So you have to live between the lines of maybe some of the other stuff that's required of us in order to feel like, for me, in order to feel like I've got that freedom. So I can still exercise freedom that way, that value. So oftentimes I'll look at what is it that I need? What does the day require of me? And how does that value sort of integrate into that day? What does that look like so that I'm living in that day and not feeling like the invisible man to this life that sometimes asks a lot of things and creates a lot of distractions for us. The other thing I will do is I've recorded myself for 10 minutes talking about really the things that I hope to achieve, the things that are important, and see, just running myself through a window of, imagine this, what does this look like for you? And it's such a neat thing because it's only about a 10-minute audio, but I've recorded it for myself so that I can start to really work on that awareness and live that in my days. And so, and it's very helpful. I'll run it at night or, when I have a moment during the day. That's important. I would also say that another important element is really, and I've done this a lot more with clients these days, is helping them understand their own personality through a personality assessment. Well, I like the Enneagram. That's one of my favorite personality assessments because it's the only one that really kind of tells you what you look like when you're having a bad day. And I think that's important because if I'm, for instance, on that scale, I'm a 6, and 6s, when they're having a bad day, can have a tendency to catastrophize. So it's unburdening for me to know, hey, there's nothing wrong with me. It's just, that's how I am. That's how I'm built. So when I have a bad day, it's great to have those sort of instructions to say, okay, if I have a tendency to catastrophize, then first of all, nothing's wrong with me. That's how I'm built. So how do I change that so that that doesn't feel that heavy anymore? So I think you can do it in a few ways, but I do think, again, assessing your value. What's your big value? Can you come down with maybe one or two that you can live in your days? What's your purpose? Is there a purpose? Maybe a small goal that's achievable. And really, how are you dialoguing with your own self? What does that conversation look like in your head when you have that internal dialogue? A lot of those things are important because if we don't pay attention to them, the day will really command, the units of process from us that we don't have time to think about this. So we have to take that back and take ownership of that so that the day doesn't take it from us. And I think those are the important elements of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really great tip. Thank you for sharing that. And finally, before we let you go, we have open mic. I know that you had some ideas of what you wanted to talk about. So the floor is all yours. Take it away.
I would say probably in looking at what we've talked about today, there is one element that I did, and again, I left it out there. If we had more time, we could talk about it. But it's really the element of fear, and fear really that stops us from doing a lot of things. We have fears that yesterday will turn out like tomorrow, and those kind of things. It's some of the basis for what we were talking about. I'm actually writing a book on fear right now, and really kind of looking at how fear had started in my own life, and it began when I was just a young boy, and I was hit by a driver while I was riding my bicycle, and ended up, comatose and everything else, and amazingly came out of it. I had just fractures that were all over my skull, is what the doctors told me. All of that healed. They couldn't believe it. In 2 years, all of those fractures sealed. Of course, I was young, so a lot of that stuff sealed. But I don't think I had a chance to process a lot of that. There was then a fear of riding bicycles. And the funny thing is, I never got on a bicycle. I actually got on a bike probably when I turned 45. And it took me that long to get back on a bike. And when I did, it was a wonderful experience. Not only did I feel like a kid again, and that I could take care of that child and sort of parent that child inside of me, but that now I was a smarter and more aware rider, and I could just enjoy all aspects of it. So I just remember that feeling again of I can do this again, and I can get past that fear. Same thing happened with swimming. It's sort of a similar kind of incident where, you have that fear. I was going to a swimming class and they weren't watching me. And all of a sudden I felt like I was drowning, and I never went back to that swim class, but I avoided anything that had anything to do with swimming for years. And it was funny. It wasn't until we had our, I'm sorry, I'm using that word funny because it's ironic and weird and strange, but funny in that kind of way. But it wasn't until I was married and with children, and I was thinking, I should learn to swim, because what happens if they need me? And it just bothered me. And so I told my wife, you know what, let's try this. Now it's different. I'm not a kid at a swimming lessons class. Let's see if we can do this. And so we went to a class for terrified adults. And the first thing that happened was that the person who was supposed to teach it wasn't there. They had a substitute. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a substitute in the class. And I told my wife, I was so scared. I said, let's do this on our own. And so what we did, we congratulated ourselves for at least getting in the water that day. So we went out for a steak dinner and said, we did that. but I felt like we can do more. And so we had a local neighborhood swimming pool. And I said, let's just get in the shallow. We'll start to learn slowly, with each other, holding each other, making sure neither of us, fall under. We'll use noodles or whatever. We'll start kicking. We'll do that. And it took us about 3 months, and both of us learned to swim. And I have been swimming ever since. I was about 45, around the same time. And that was a huge fear. That was a fear that I had maintained for a long time. So I think fears can be very pervasive. I've probably skipped a lot of things that I would have loved to have gone to as a teenager, swimming parties and things like that. And, so fear can take over our lives in many ways, but it can also be a very helpful thing. And that sounds strange, but it's important, because to be fearless, I think, it's not to be very smart. So how do we then take fear and begin to understand it in our lives and really start to live a full life that's not governed by fear, but that fear becomes a very constructive element in how we approach our lives daily. And so I'm writing this particular book. There's some instances that I use. I think, relatability is always a good thing. So I'm willing to share parts of my life because they all turn out good. They all have positive aspects to them, but they were all at some point governed by fear. And so I think it's just a big part of, it's important. We don't want to be daredevil and be, without fear. We want fear in a way that's constructive for us, because it teaches us things too, not to step off a ledge or whatever. We need to know fear, but in a very wise way. Yeah. So hopefully I'll finish that book here soon, and that one will be out. But I'll probably do a blog post as just a teaser to that soon. So.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you. I think that's a really powerful message to close with. And we're excited to find out when the book's coming out, whenever it comes out. I'm sure our audience would like to check it out. So please make sure you share the details with us. And actually, if our audience would like to stay in touch or subscribe to your newsletter to find out when the book's coming out, where should they go?
A good way is you can either you can check my blog. There's a way to correspond at Psychology Today, so you can find me. Just Google me, Rodney Luster, Psychology Today, and you'll find me easy on the internet. You'll see my blog post there. So again, that's one way to find me. You can also write to me personally at mytherapy.247@gmail.com is another way to find me. So again, those are two of probably the easiest ways to get to me. But yeah, definitely Psychology Today is probably the better of the two, because then you get more of a flavor for what I've written, and maybe something helpful comes from it too. So.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much for that. And thanks for coming on the show today. I think it's been a really great topic. I'm sure we can explore it from so many other angles. We didn't get to talk about it from the professional aspect, in our lives, right? We have work, and, how does that work in reality? Maybe we can have a follow-up episode just on that, because I think that's very interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Be happy to.
Yeah. You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.